I'm going to read this verbatim, and I'm only going to read it once. Many of America's children have entered a world where no government official will ever check on what or how well they're being taught. I hope you're sitting down for this episode of Right Angle with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible. Gentlemen, that line was from the Washington Post, and I left a small phrase out of it. Many of America's new homeschooled children have entered such a world where no government official is tracking their behavior. And it turns out that homeschooling has experienced a bit of a surge since about 2017. The Washington Post had a hard time getting hard figures in some jurisdictions because they're not always necessarily counting how many are in homeschools, but they do know that public school attendance has fallen off about 4%. Private school attendance has risen about 7%. But homeschooled students in the states they were able to get data from, it's up like 51% in the last 6 years or so. And what I found interesting about this is not that people would find that homeschooling is appealing. And by the way, there was a bit of a greater surge during the pandemic. Actually, no, it really did. It just kept on its upward trajectory, but it's fallen off a bit since the pandemic. But a lot of people are still doing it. So it's not like it plummeted back to pre-pandemic levels or anything like that. Bill, what I find fascinating about this is the way the Post approached the story. First of all, just saying that they're entering a world where no government official will ever check on them.
I was cheering. I was going to launch fireworks.
What's the opposite of 1984?
It's such a sinister thing. And then acknowledging that homeschooling is the fastest growing form of education, they refer to it as a, quote, largely unregulated practice once confined to the ideological fringe. Elsewhere in the story, they say that some, 40 years ago or more, it was illegal in some places. And I was like, gee, Washington Post, our history is a little longer than 40 years. You could have gone back a little further to see what it was like before that, but they didn't. And they do acknowledge late in the story that the rise of homeschooling has led critics of weak regulation to sound alarms. Who has that on their business card, by the way?
William Whittle.
I'm a
critic of weak regulations.
Regulation, yeah. So they quote a Harvard professor emeritus, which in most
then must be true.
Most professions it's just you're retired, but they're emeritus, saying her name is Elizabeth Bartholet, and she says we should worry about whether they're learning anything. All these students that are in people's homes. Now, Bill, I will say up front something that the Post really doesn't make explicit, except in a roundabout way, despite the fact that it is the fastest growing form of education for kids, it's still a relatively small group and frankly hard to count. Back in 2019, the best numbers they have say that there were about 1.5 million homeschooled students in the country. The Post now estimates somewhere between 1.9 and 2.7 million homeschool students. Still a relative blip, but growing at a very fast rate everywhere from rural Kentucky to New York City. Bill, what do you think not only of the continued rise and accelerating rise? I mean, it's almost a straight line up, but also the fact that the Washington Post seems to report it as if it were something to be feared.
Well, for the Washington Post, it is something to be feared. When your Harvard professor emeritus says that she's really worried that they may not be learning anything, what she's really saying is that they're worried that they may be learning something. They may be learning something about the history of this country. They may be learning something about the structure of the government. They may be learning math, which means they can add and do calculations on all kinds of other things. They may be learning to think for themselves. They may be learning that there's an alternative view of America other than the birthplace and perpetual home of slavery. They may learn a lot of things that these people have basically spent the last 80 years now, but certainly the last 40, really trying to make sure they don't learn. This is just a simple case of voting with your feet. American public schools, this needs to be said, American public schools for a century and a half were the envy of the world. And people would send ambassadors to America to see a country that educated 98% of its population was literate at no cost to them in terms of having to pay for the schooling directly. Anyway, obviously paid through taxes, because ain't nothing is free. But it was a model for the world. And after the Russians, those filthy communists put Sputnik up, all of a sudden everything kicked into gear in this country. And within the space of 2 years, we created entire armies of engineers and scientists who went to the moon doing the math in their heads. So it started out as a magnificent social landmark. It was something to really be proud of. And then along come public sector unions, and that's the end of everything. So the decline of the schools began when it became impossible to fire bad teachers. And once it became impossible to remove bad teachers, the left looked at this and said, well, obviously we're in the mind control business. Give us your kids and we'll raise the next generation to believe this nonsense that we believe in. And so basically what happens is the schools continue to degrade. And I've said this several times, it bears mentioning. If you were to plot a graph of when the when the education Department of Education was summoned from the depths of hell, you could watch the quality of the test scores going down. And the other thing you'll notice about it, Scott, if you look at a real simple graph of American recent history in education, you'll notice if you start from when the Department of Education was incubated, you'll see that over the course of the intervening years, test scores have gone down and money spent on education has gone up to the point where we now spend 3.5 times more per student than any other country in the world in order to get the 30th best test scores on the planet. That's just plain consumer economics. We're paying through the nose for a garbage product, and if somebody comes along with a better product, then we will do that because most parents value their kids' future above everything else. And let's face it, homeschooling is a major pain in the butt. It's not easy and it's not fun. But better that certainly than having them go to a school where they not only don't learn anything of any value, they are inculcated on a daily basis to values antithetical to yours. These teachers are no longer even teachers in the way that we understand it. When we were in school, you would have teachers who had a chemistry teacher was a guy who used to be a chemist. Now a chemistry teacher is a 23-year-old education major. And she's more interested in getting validation from her 7th grade class about her transgender girlfriend than she is about teaching chemistry. So it's not a surprise. The schools have put themselves out of business, and so have the universities. I believe that brick and mortar universities, ivy covered walls, it kills me to say it, but those are finished. They are irrevocably
corrupted,
poisoned, and corrupted is the word. So the last thing I'll say on this point, though, however, is there is an enormous market opportunity out there for people to supply high quality, classically liberal education programs that can be delivered to people for their own homeschooling needs. And the way to really make this thing take off is to essentially have parents on the lowest possible level, like the neighborhood, the block level, basically say, okay, look, we've got 9 kids on the block here are homeschooled. So instead of each one of us doing all of the subjects, how about if Janet handles the history lessons for everybody and so on, you get a curriculum that's approved by Hillsdale College or something like that, and there's a lot of money to be made in this. But the one thing I keep coming back to is the one thing that we are completely wasting is our retired people who really would like to have something to do. They are absolute experts of 50 years of chemistry or engineering or mathematics or whatever. They're sitting there doing nothing, and next door there are kids that are going to school and cannot name 3 countries outside of the United States. It's a criminal It's just criminal across the board.
Hey, Scott, can I throw in something to Bill real quick? That retirement thing that struck a note. My father-in-law, who was he was in the Air Force, and then he worked for a ballistic missile defense company after he retired from the Air Force. Finally, at the age of 80, retired last year. And his retirement lasted for about 3 months. He retired in May, and then when the school year began, he was volunteering to teach math at the elementary school, and he's so happy.
Good.
Because retirement will kill people who are really good and love their job. It's not good.
Well, those things that Bill mentioned are already underway and well along. The production of excellent curriculum by a wide variety of private companies, the co-ops that have formed among parents of homeschoolers. In fact, in the Washington Post article, one woman was talking about how they used to have about 40 kids in her area that were involved in a co-op years ago of pulling together kids for group activities or for having parents teach a particular topic or whatever. She said that same group is now 600 kids and
awesome.
And continues to grow. And the interesting thing is they found no correlation between the rapidity of the rise of homeschooling and the quality of the school district as measured by or assessed by standardized tests. So even in so-called good school districts, they find that the homeschooling movement continues to grow because it's not all parents who are just saying, hey, my kid can't get a good education at that school, or although a lot of parents do comment about the political nature of some of the teaching, that's not the only thing. Steve, there are also parents' concerns about school shootings, about bullying, about just kind of the general environment, kind of the peer group influence of these large sort of, I call them factory farm schools. They list those things among the spurs to get them involved in homeschooling. Florida, as one might imagine, not only a populous state, but also favorable toward things like school vouchers and charters and homeschooling, has roughly 154,000 homeschooled kids and is actually, they have just expanded their voucher program to include homeschoolers. And so in the not too distant future, parents who are willing to show that they have an instructional plan and their kids will take annual standardized tests can get up to $80,000 a year. I'm sorry, $8,000 a year in school vouchers. Of course, that's money right out of the mouths of those poor public school kids, and as the teachers' unions are quick to point out. But it's not just Florida. New York's population of homeschooled students has doubled since 2017 to 52,000. New York City, in 24 of 33 New York City school districts, growth of at least 200% among the homeschooled population there over the last 6 years. And still, it's a speck, relatively speaking, but it is a rapidly growing speck, almost geometric progression of growth here. Steve, one of the things I noticed about the Washington Post coverage, and maybe this is just me, you read more news than I do, so you can tell me, but there were two graphics in the story, and one was this chart that showed, the slow decline of public schools, the slight increase of private schools, and then this kind of skyrocketing movement or growth of homeschooling. And the line for the homeschoolers was a red line going up. And then there was another graph that showed it's kind of a block graph of the United States. So each state was represented as a square that they were all exactly the same size squares, and then they had the number or the percentage of increase of homeschoolers in each one of them. The higher the rate of increase, for example, I'm looking at New York and Rhode Island and Washington, D.C. area and Tennessee, the higher the percentage rate of growth, the more red the color. So the states that were experiencing the greatest growth in homeschooling are denominated by a red background, and then the other ones are kind of goes to orange and then kind of a pale yellow kind of color. Steve, is that just because red is a pretty color, or do you think there's some other message that we're getting here?
Oh yeah, they're signaling danger, danger, danger. And the Washington Post, keep in mind, it's a crap paper. It's not a newspaper. It is a comfort read for far left ideologues and Washington types. That's
perfect. Comfort read.
That's all it is. Didn't I do a right angle on this just a week or two ago about the Washington Post's terrible reporting on the so-called hospital bombing in Gaza?
It was, yeah, we just put it up as the Times, though.
Yeah, so this is the kind of newspaper the Washington Post is. It's not news. It confirms the worldview of people who need their worldview confirmed. You reminded me, Scott. There was a comedy routine from Jeff Altman. I had this album of his 30 years ago or more, where he gets to college and he's trying to decide what his major is, and the dean's bugging him. You need a major, need a major, need a major. And he finally says, fine, math. The dean says, okay. And he says, wait. What am I going to do with a math degree? And the dean says, you'll teach. And he said, well, what will they do? And the dean said, they'll teach too. And Jeff Altman says, oh my God, it's Amway with a football team. And what we have now, especially in the Ivy League schools, where it's much more about lefty indoctrination than about education, it's Amway with death camps. Maybe not yet, but that's the direction they're going in. If you want to know how seemingly ordinary people herd other ordinary people into cattle cars, look at some of the responses on the left, particularly on college campuses, to what's going on in Gaza right now. Those are the people. All right. To actually answer your question, there's a lot to chew on here, but it's a positive movement that is not without its own dangers. I believe in competition. I believe in homeschooling. If you're in a bad district, or if you just think it's the right thing for your kids, get them out. Teach them yourselves, get together with your neighbors, do the co-op thing, do it. But here's the thing. One of the reasons American public education was such a marvel is it was for everybody. As Bill said, 98% of the kids could read and got a good education, and this was such a great equalizer. This was part of the American dream.
And mixer, too, a mixer,
absolutely. And everybody who wanted a chance could come out of high school with what now would be a college degree practically, and be able, if they had the ambition and the drive to take on the world, whether that meant directly or going to a university first. And what we're seeing here is more of this bifurcation. This is just another example of it. As our public institutions crumble, we get the folks who are pulling their kids out of the bad schools and giving them better educations at home, and the kids whose parents either are not motivated or are not well educated enough themselves or just don't care enough, whose kids are stuck in these schools getting their futures robbed from them in these failing schools, these failed schools. And I think the left wants this. We see the same thing when it comes to marriage. We watch marriage rates decline, and we see the rates of single motherhood increase. And if you want the most important indicator for a life of crime, it's growing up without a dad in the house. That's the number one indicator for ending up in prison. And you don't see that among the credentialed class. Credentialed people tend to get married, stay married, raise kids in a stable two-parent home, while they are telling all of their underlings, telling all the Morlocks, oh yeah, marriage is passé, you don't need that, single motherhood is just fine. And so yes, there are solutions. There are solutions. We're watching them develop organically, but it's not a solution if it doesn't result in change, in improvements, in restructuring of our public institutions. That's what we need to set the long-term goal to be.
Well, I was just struck by the overall tone of this article. And maybe it's because I was raised by my grandparents and know how life was back in the old-timey days. But it just struck me that the Washington Post seemed just absolutely shocked that people might educate their own children. You know, the model that was used for thousands of years before we came up with this government-run model of things. And they just didn't seem to get it. And they were quoting, so-called experts, our Harvard University professor emeritus and child welfare specialists and two different union leaders. One of the union leaders runs a state teachers union in Kentucky. And listen to this argument for why we need to be really concerned about homeschoolers and the threat they pose because of the, basically, public schools get funded based on enrollment. And so if you take kids out of the schools, that reduces the amount of money that goes from the state or federal government to the school. And so this state union president said that public school is, quote, the heart of the community in which it is situated. People gather there for football games, concerts, to celebrate the academic success of their students. And I thought, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But anyway, so she's basically making the argument not so much that homeschooling isn't as good as public schooling, or that public schooling should be sustained and supported because of the excellent education it provides, but rather it's a place where people can get together and watch a game or hear a concert, or clap for a graduate. And the post itself notes that public school buildings make useful disaster relief shelters. I thought, you're getting down to the bottom of the barrel of arguments when you're saying, look, we need to make sure we have our public schools around because in the next tornado, where are you going to go? And I think we ought to keep those buildings around and just, sweep them once a month to make sure they're ready for the next tornado. But the desperation from the media, the leftist media, as well as from the teachers' unions, is really misplaced. I mean, there's a simple answer to this, and it's not banning homeschooling or preventing state governments from offering homeschooling vouchers. The simple answer is make public school good. That is
again.
Why not? Why not look at it and say, instead of, hey, why are people taking their kids out of public school in such rapidly growing numbers? Instead of getting angry at those people, maybe they need to have focus groups. Maybe they need to sit down with some of those people and say, hey, I noticed you pulled your kid out of school last year. Do you mind telling me about that? I'm not going to try to persuade you or argue with you. I'm just curious. Why did that happen? What could we have done better so that your child would still be in our school? And then do some of that stuff. If they thought like a business rather than an entitled organization that is an indispensable arm of the government, then this article never would have happened, because there wouldn't be such a rapid growth of homeschooling, because people would say, you know what? I can't think of a better place to send my kid than that local elementary school. God bless them. I'm glad they're there. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.